Everyone, it's Zach here. Today I'm going to walk through converting my EDA integration with Dynatrace from using the Problems API source plugin to the Webhook source plugin. I'm doing this because the Red Hat and the Ansible community have kind of shifted towards two recommended patterns for EDA source plugins, and that's going to be using event buses, so kind of a subscription model. Think your Kafka broker or other message bus solutions, and webhooks. Right, so we have the generic webhook that you can use, but we're also now recommending that our vendors who are implementing custom source plugins use one of those two models. And the reason why vendors would implement an additional webhook would be to add, some custom logic to the events being received, as opposed to just using the generic webhook plugin that Red Hat provides. So there's a couple of reasons why we're doing this. It's going to be one, it's more instantaneous, right? So when you use the polling method, there's a built-in delay, right? Whatever frequency you're polling a particular, API or something along those lines, there's a delay. And we wanted to make sure that in these production, like mission-critical systems that we're talking about, there's no delay for the delivery of messages. The other thing is that it reduces unnecessary chatter over the network, right? So when you're polling, whether or not there is a event worth receiving, you're going to be communicating with your target ever so often. With the webhook model, since you're pushing from the source to EDA, the push only happens when there's an event, right? So you save some of that chatter over the wire, which can be very good, especially when you talk about a system like Dynatrace that may have a ton of integrations, right? We don't want EDA pinging Dynatrace for no reason. So the change here was actually a little bit more challenging than I originally anticipated, but I hope, like me walking through my experience, helps you to change. And if you haven't actually done an implementation of the Problems API, I think this post can still be useful to you, right? You can see how you can use what I'm showing here to set it up from scratch. So you'll just be skipping the parts where I talk about converting, the rulebooks and things like that. So the first thing I want to start with is the Dynatrace Logistics, right? So there are some things now, when you move from polling the Problems API to actually using the push from Dynatrace, there's some things you need to configure on the Dynatrace side to make this work. So the first thing I'm going to talk through is setting up a connection to your Event-Driven Ansible instance. And of course, I've got screenshots and things in the post, but for the video, I'm going to actually walk through what this is going to look like. So what I would do here is I would just go to the search bar in my Dynatrace instance, and I'm going to search connection, and you'll see some things pop up, right? There's an option here for Red Hat Event-Driven Ansible connections. That's what we're going to click today. So I've got one configured, but I'll go ahead and click, you'll have the option to add an item. I'd give it a useful name, right? So I think the one I used in the blog was eda.example.com, or, this is arbitrary, call it what you want. The URL is important. So I'm going to say http eda.example.com, and then the port. So I'll put 5,000 in here just as an example, but this port, note it down, right? Because this is going to need to match the port you use when you configure the source plugin in your rulebook. And similarly with the access token, so I used Bitwarden to generate an access token. I then input it here in my connection configuration, and I will also use that in the configuration of my rulebook as well, similar to the port. So for now, I'll type in secret or something like that, right? But I'm going to go ahead and discard this because I already have one set up. And the next step we're going to want to do is make sure we add the host to our allow list. So if I go to search and I say limit outbound connections, this will take me to this setting preferences, limit outbound connections. And you'll see here, I've added some items to my allow list. This is my EDA instance and controller. You'll want to add your EDA instance. So in this example, it would be eda.example.com. Pretty simple, but this will make sure that the workflow can actually reach out to your EDA instance and not receive a failure. And then now we can actually move on to the Workflows tab. So in the Workflows tab, there's a couple things we're going to need to do. The first thing is going to be around giving permissions to workflows. So by default, your workflow may not have permissions. If you used it in the past, you may have already done this, but I'm going to go to the settings up here, authorization settings, and you'll see there's some primary permissions that are recommended. I'd go ahead and check all 3 of those to allow your workflows to function properly. And if I scroll down to these secondary permissions, I went ahead and selected the whole group for automation. And if I scroll down, I went into storage and I basically selected everything that my user account has permissions to do. So minus some writing to Grail really, and then field set information. Of course, this is not zero trust by any means, but you can also, if you want to step through these one by one, for me, it was more development. I wanted to make sure that my DQL query worked, which I'll talk through in a few minutes, without any issues as I was developing. And I'm going to go ahead and take away permissions as needed once I'm through with this. So one thing I'll mention as well, when you go through this process, there are some gotchas. So when you're thinking about the port specifically, I noted in the blog post, so I use Cloudflare as my DNS. Cloudflare only supports certain ports being routed through. So there's a link in the references to those ports if you're using Cloudflare, or if you're using a different DNS, just be aware that may be a limitation. So you'll need to figure out what ports you can actually use. And then whenever you do set up a port or choose on a port, you'll want to go ahead and make sure you set up a firewall rule on your EDA server so that those requests are allowed in and the whole workflow can connect well. So now I'm going to go ahead and go back to workflows, and I'm going to click on my actual workflow that I've created, because this is where the meat of the logic exists now. So when you go ahead and create one, you'll basically select event trigger. I chose event type events. I think there's a biz events. In this case, events works. The first part of the logic that you can use here is, this is kind of where I ensure that only one event for a particular problem is coming through. So I'm limiting it to Davis problems. I am using this status transition created. This prevents it from happening multiple times, right? So you may have multiple events for the same Davis problem, but if the status transition is from created, that means it's only going to fire the first time it's created, which is what I was looking for. And then I also just make sure there's an affected entity, right? Because I don't want to send it to EDA with no entity to remediate. And then I also match values on an alerting profile. This was actually useful for my team. We're all working on a similar Dynatrace instance. I don't want to be grabbing events that someone else is generating, so I use an alerting profile to kind of scope those to events that I quote unquote own and want to use for my demos. So I go to the decorate event. This is the piece I added, and probably took me the longest time to really kind of work through. And this is where I'm transforming the raw event that comes with the event trigger into the payload that I want to send forward to EDA. So it's a DQL query, and you can actually test these. If you go to, if I search here and I go to logs, I think it's logs and events is what it's called. So if I go here, there's an actual ability to click on advanced mode, and you can actually test your queries here. So this is what I use to develop mine. If I go back, show you kind of what I ended up building out. I effectively, these inputs here are Jinja templated, so you can see this kind of variabilization here. So really all I needed to build the data model I wanted was the event ID, and then I can use a DQL query to kind of pull the information I want. So I'm filtering the events, right, based off that ID, and then again I'm just doubling down on the status transition created. I probably should be fine because of my filter above. And then I add some fields, so I get the first affected entity ID. In my particular case, I'm looking at one entity for the alerts that I'm creating. If there was a possibility you'd have multiple in an array, maybe there's some sort of explode operation where you take one record and create more than one. I'd have to do some more research on that. I then create a field for problem ID, which is the event ID for the particular event that comes through. And then I do a join. This was actually really important for me. I wanted to pull the host name, which didn't come as a part of the event. All you get is the ID, the host ID from the Dyntrace side. So actually join on host using that host ID, and then I grab the host name field. And then the last piece is I'm just selecting the fields I want, right? So the payload that's going to be sent across the wire is going to have host name, host ID, problem ID, and so forth. And then for send event to Event-Driven Ansible, you'll see the input here. That might be a little bit confusing. If you go to options here, what I did was I looped. So the DQL query will give you a results array. In my case, I'm probably going to only ever have one, but I just kind of challenged myself to do this to make sure I could get it to work in case there were more than one result. So what I did is I loop over decorate event, which is that previous task. So that would be whatever name you give it, and then .records, and then the variable name I specified as decorated. You can call that what you want, but what's going to be important is this little hint here. It's showing you how to use it. So if I come back to input, that will explain this for you. So I'm templating out an individual event. So if there were multiple records, I would basically be sending multiple events to EDA. And the only other piece here is that connection, right? So we already set that up. So just select your connection. And once you've done that, and an event comes through, the workflow will actually execute. And you can see here I've got some successful executions. If I click on params for the event trigger, this can be really great for debugging. So the first time you set this up, I'm not gonna lie, it's probably gonna fail. But you can come in here and kind of see what's actually been sending across the wire, and you can, make changes to your different steps as needed, right? Using the body of data that you get. So you can kind of see the information here, and this is how I built out my queries. I really focus on event ID. If I go down, you'll see, it took me a few times to get my DQL query to work, but once I did, you can see my input here. You can see that ID got rendered. So that's that Jinja templating in action. And then I can see my result. Let's go to records actually. You can see my result, and this is that body, that payload data model that I wanted, right? So this is what's going to be sent forth to Event-Driven Ansible. And for me, again, host name is important. So this is what I'm matching to my inventory when I run a downstream workflow. And then if I go to send event to Event-Driven Ansible, you can see again my input here. If I click to maximize, basically it wraps each record, right? Because remember we looped on the records list. It's going to wrap each one, and it's going to add this key event data, and then plop it in there. So I note in my blog post, when it actually gets to the rulebook, it's going to be wrapped in an additional kind of object structure. So it's going to be that event.payload, and then you're going to get event data, and then your data model. So I put an example of kind of what actually got sent to my EDA server in the blog post. But you can see here, this is the changes that need to be made in the rulebook. It's actually pretty simple. Here's my old one if you want to take a look at what that looked like, but this is the DT Webhook source plugin configuration, listening on the EDA server. I variabilized the port, so I just put that in my rulebook activation as well as the token. And that's, again, going to need to match what I put in the connection on the Dynatrace side. If I scroll down here, the only other changes I really had to make, so this is the same kind of rule, logic, and everything that I used for the problems API, but I just changed how I'm referencing variables. So this might have been, affected entity IDs, array 0, .name. Whereas now it's like I established this data model, and then I can say .name. I know it's going to be free disk space below. I can say, host name, which is the host I want to send over to the controller. And then if I keep scrolling to the right here, similar, right? Problem ID I set up, things like that. So the rest of the playbook, it was really just updating those variables. And everything kind of worked as expected once I got the data model mapped over correctly. So I'm going to leave you with that. Do stay tuned if you want to see kind of like the downstream of that actual workflow. So I haven't done a blog post for my free disk space remediation, but I'll be doing that in the future. Today I really wanted to focus on just the conversion process from Problems API to the webhook. Thanks for listening. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat, or if you run into obstacles if you're doing the same process, please let me know. Thanks.